I didn't see the
Cassandra has,
author.
yeah, Cassandra Lane has joined us. Thank you so much for coming. Everybody give it up virtually. Virtual claps.
So much for
Um,
having me.
yeah, no, we were really last week your story was in our reading, and everyone just loved it, as I relayed to you. We all thought it was a standout contribution to the piece. So I'm really excited that you agreed to join us all the way from sunny Los Angeles.
Oh, sun out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's start. I was thinking maybe we could just ask some questions about Skinned. I know this is a bit of a blast from Cassandra's past. If you
Years
want to do
ago.
a little intro of what you're doing now and what you're working on now, and feel free to use the chat to pop in anything that you'd like us to see or stay in touch with. But yeah, why don't you, Cassandra, give just a little intro about yourself, and then maybe we can open it up to questions.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So good to see everyone. Thank you so much for reading this anthology. I'm from Louisiana, and I had moved from New Orleans to LA in 2001, August. I started my MFA program that December. Had a lot of fellow students from New York. So everybody was still dazed from 9/11. And I remember my first professor, Nanama Dankwa, who's the author of Willow Weep for Me. She was really close friends with Greg Tate, like a brother to her. And she read one of my pieces that I submitted for workshop, and she said, "I think this piece needs to be in this book. The deadline has already passed." But you can't tell Nanama no. So she pitched Greg and said, "I think you need to read my student's piece." He loved it, and then he talked to his editors at his main editor, Beth, at or Becca was her name, or is her name, Rebecca, at Random House, and they ended up accepting it even though the deadline had passed and they were about to go to press. And then we did some quick edits back and forth, signed the contract, and that was my first semester. So it was a whirlwind. That's not what I was I was there to learn, and which I did for the 2 years that I was there. But it was nice to also get that confirmation from the publishing world. And I remember her emailing me, the editor at Random House, "Do you have a book ready to go or almost ready to go?" And I didn't. I was nowhere near submitting a book length, manuscript. And it took me years to finally finish Off and On. And that book published in 2001. It's called We Are Bridges, and Skinned is a part of that. Variation of Skin is a part of that book, and I gave credits to Greg and Nanama and Random House. So that's the story of Skinned and what I'm doing now. I'm trying to work on my second book, but I'm also a magazine editor. I'm a mom, so juggling all those balls.
Awesome. How beautiful. What a great story to hear. That was such some great backstory on Skinned. And if I read it and it was past deadline, I'd take it too. So bravo, good decision on their part. Does anyone want to start off with questions? I can start it off. I was wondering if you could talk about language in Skinned, the language of Skinned. One of my major questions actually was the title.
Oh, yes. And
I went back and forth with that a lot.
Oh, I'm sorry. I had a quick question for you guys in terms of how you came to the book. Did you know Greg, or how was the book
Ron, I'm sorry, Ron. Oh my God, Ron's never here, so I forgot to introduce him. Ron is actually the executive director of this lovely nonprofit that I get to facilitate for, called One Book, One Box. Ron, do you want to chime in really quickly, introduce yourself and maybe how we came to this book?
So you did the intros, but how we came to the book is I was actually looking for a couple of books to sort of counter the popular hip hop narrative that is happening now for the 50th anniversary of hip hop. That, everything that came out of that, and prior to this book, we read when chicken heads come home to roost. So I was just looking for books that were sort of more critical of that sort of hip hop narrative, but not being so overtly parallel to it, but like using all the different sort of tropes and narratives that were being sort of popularized within hip hop, but then there was this whole other sort of parallel narrative going on. One is like how hip hop has been appropriated, which is kind of the extension of this book, but also in Joan Morgan's book, how women were treated within hip hop. So that's how I selected these two books.
Oh, awesome. And do you remember when this book came out, or it came to you just in recent?
So I published a literary magazine called Mosaic,
Oh, I know
and
most.
yeah, so I'm always getting books, and I've kind of worked tangentially in publishing, so I knew about the book when it first, and I met Greg Tate a couple of times also.
Okay, okay. I was just curious. I love that.
Yeah.
In terms of language, again, I had been in Louisiana all my life, and it was my first time living outside of my home state. And as you can imagine, just a huge culture shock, just geographically, coming from this wet, hot, swampy environment, very close-knit community, just the way people spoke and cooked and ate, and contrasting that with this very dry, desert-like Mediterranean climate, LA with all of its hills and mountains just within reach. And I loved hiking, and I just loved thinking about home. I hadn't thought about home in that way. It's always saying, when you're part of the soup or you're part of the gumbo, you're not thinking, you're just part of the ingredients. But being taken out of that gumbo helped me look back on my past and on my people in a way that I hadn't done while I lived in Louisiana. And I was 30 years old when I moved here. And I was in the MFA program. I thought I was going to write about one thing, and that's not what I ended up writing about. This story about my great-grandfather, Bert Bridges, is what just came, and I started dreaming about him. And I remember my great-grandmother, Mary, very well. She lived with us. I was 11 when she died, and I was dealing with a lot of my own, as you can tell from the essay, my own, internal battles, and doing therapy, journaling, trying to figure myself out. And I think the language probably came in that those sharp contrasts between geography and people and the sense and just the food. My first place here in LA was Glendale, which is heavily populated by elderly Armenian people. And so I was in my MFA program, I was working from home, doing freelance, and I would have the French windows open and smell the spices from these Lebanese and Armenian women's kitchens. It made me very nostalgic for my own grandparents and their cooking and the different spices. And I think that's where it started. It started with me longing. I loved California and loved exploring, but I was longing to know more about my family, about our history, missing people. I didn't have any, relatives here. And I wanted to get inside the language that made us different from what I was experiencing.
Beautiful. If you want to ask a question, you can definitely just unmute your mic or feel free to use the raised hand feature. We went back and forth about the title a lot. Last week I questioned, why do y'all think she named it Skinned? And we had a few different reasons, but I was wondering if you could talk to us about it. I think it's in here, it's in the pages, but maybe it's not.
Yeah. I think probably what I initially thought, you know, my friends and Rick, my ex-husband, all of our friends back in New Orleans thought we were like the perfect, you know, Black couple. People weren't saying, you know, Black excellence, and that was before social media, but I think in their minds that's what they thought. And so what we presented, and he's still a dear friend and I love him to death. But I think what we presented in terms of, you know, happy Black successful couple, was different from some of the things that were going on internally, individually, and in the relationship. And that's what I was interested in, like getting beyond the skin, the surface of a relationship, getting beyond the skin, the surface of so-called beauty, getting beyond the skin and surface of our family, even, you know, the secrets that were there, the things that people didn't want to talk about. Those were the, and then what that story with my grandparents, my mother's parents, the car accident, and how she saw that man's face, you know, completely peeled off. Like all of that was going through my mind, I think, as I was writing and coming up with the title. What about you? What did you guys say?
We said a few things. Y'all chime in if I forget any. I just remember one. Actually, we were talking about the light-skinned, dark-skinned. Like that's how people say those terms. I remember Sabrina, you said that. I was actually thinking about like actually someone being skinned and what the character for sure. Like, would she have these complications and like this trauma in life if people were skinned, if she didn't see that, right? If there was no color barrier for her to have to navigate around. What were some of the other things we were saying? Does anyone remember?
Everybody's shy.
I had said about I had compared it to the episode of Lovecraft Country, where one of the episodes, I can't remember which number episode, but one of the characters in it, she wants to be white so badly, so she goes back and forth, but it's like it only lasts for 12 hours, so literally you can see the skin peel off of her when she's white into back to her own skin, and it teaches her that she really wants to be Black and comfortable in her skin. But when I read this essay, that episode of Lovecraft Country was on my mind.
Wow, that's such a grotesque thing too when you think about it beyond metaphor, and even in today's times, people bleaching, and it's deep and disturbing, and I remember that episode.
Or even I don't know if y'all have seen that movie. I think it's called Skin. It's about like the neo-Nazi who like can't remember exactly what he did. He gets into it with like a Black gentleman at a grocery store. I think the Black gentleman ends up like kidnapping him and tattooing his whole body Black.
Oh, wow, I haven't seen that one.
From head to toe. From head to toe, tattoos his whole body Black. And so when he goes like back home, he's a Black man, you know? And he's taught his son, you know, to hate Black people so much. And so when he walks in, I'm sorry, I'm about to spoil it for y'all. Okay. He walks in, he's been missing, mind you. He's been missing. He's been locked up in the student basement getting tattooed Black. And he walks in and his son, who's a kid, probably like 10 or 11, shoots and kills him because he thinks it's a Black man.
Wow. Wow.
I'm sorry to bring down the mood, but brilliant. And I thought about that when I was reading this too, because I was kind of like, where is this going? Like in the beginning, I was like, are we going down this kind of road where it's going to get a little dark? And then when we switched to the relationship part, it softened up a bit. Althea says the paragraph at the bottom of page 151. Althea, if you want, you can, I can't remember which line, but if you want, you can unmute yourself. Maybe she can't right now.
Okay, I sound like a man. Sorry, I have the Rona, so sorry.
Well wishes to you.
Thank you. Where she said, for the time being anyway, I try to see things from his point of view, my grandmother's. I wonder what would happen if we could turn skin inside out to its underbelly.
Yeah, right. What Brandon was referring to. And how my grandmother, I mean, she literally saw beneath this white man's skin.
Mhm.
And yet her husband was almost, like she said, railroaded. And if the white woman hadn't spoken up in that case, not a Karen, my grandfather would have been probably imprisoned or worse. So yeah, I forgot about that line. Thank you, Althea.
You know, there's a moment in the book where you and your husband are debating whether your then husband are debating whether you should go into the club or not. And it felt so visceral. Why did you go into the club? Like, why didn't you just sort of, you know, go? I mean, I believe you were in New York at the time.
Yeah,
New
he's
York
from
has
Maryland. Yeah.
New York has 20 clubs on every block.
Which, I mean, me being a visitor didn't know. And
Yeah.
he hadn't been in New York, in terms of living there in some years, because he lived in New Orleans at the time. And I was the one who had looked in the Village Voice, looking in the events section and found the club. He hadn't done any research and really wasn't a part of that. His friends back home were not like the people that I would hang out with, and wouldn't have known about any of the hip clubs to go to. So we were kind of relying on what I found out just through looking through the pages of the Village Voice. And then even though I was having that hesitancy, it was freezing cold for me. I didn't have any backups, or we might have tried another place. I don't know. But he was saying, all of the lines are going to be really long. And then there was that internal side of me that was like, I am acting crazy. Let me get it together. It's okay. So I think it was that, like, the good angel, the bad angel, like fighting with each other. And I wanted to go on in and do the quote unquote mature thing and get out of the cold and hope we could just have fun. But clearly that didn't happen.
And you were miserable inside the club.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is not a fiction story.
No. It's an essay.
This is an essay.
It's an essay. In the book, the full book length, We Are Bridges, I do fictionalize my great-grandfather and great-grandmother's love story, just to flesh that out some, because she didn't want to talk about what happened. But I wanted to humanize them and their love, because when she was in her 90s on her deathbed, she was crying about him and how much she loved him and how beautiful he was. So there are fictionalized threads throughout the book, balancing the contemporary story. But the essay, no, this is real.
Just as a side, did you have to navigate including your grandparents in your essay and in your book? Sometimes the older generation they want no part of, being in the public eye.
Yeah, you're so right. Unfortunately, they were all already gone. The person that I was talking to the most at the time of this writing, not only the essay, but the book, were my mom and my favorite uncle, Uncle Cricket, who's also gone now. But when I was writing this, he was still here, and he was egging me on. I don't know if he necessarily ever read this. I think I sent it to him. But he loved the idea of having a book about the family. He's the one who told me the little pieces of bones that I do know about Burke Bridges, and about Mississippi and the lynching. So I had his support. I don't know how. I think my mother's mother would have been, she was so supportive and proud. I think she would have been supportive. I don't know about if my great-grandmother was still around. I don't think she would have wanted any part of this in ink. but they were all gone.
Yeah, because of the trauma, right? It wasn't only traumatic for great grandmother and grandmother, but
Yeah,
it's pretty traumatic for you as well, right? Not only the family history, but navigating race and marriage and Louisiana, LA, and New York, right? Um,
yeah,
for
that's
some-
right. We think about the Great Migration. So many of, Mississippi, they went north, and a lot of Louisianians came here west. My family was not part of that Great Migration. They all chose to stay, but 30 years later, I did come. But yeah, no matter where you go, and you're thinking about just that triangle, south to north and west, you still can escape that past. And so I figured at some point, why not just go ahead and just face it? And I did that for my way of doing that was through writing, but also therapy and talking to my son once I did become a mom. And also, healing and finding joy and making sure that even if I don't feel comfortable, that I'm putting myself in places that I deserve to be in, and going out for opportunities that I deserve to go after. But yeah, you can't escape it.
This may be too personal, but what conversations did you have with your son? Like, what was it when your son was like a baby, an adult? I don't know how old he is now, but
Yeah, he's 16 now, going on 30, but I think so when he was younger, definitely I didn't tell him about the lynching or anything, but he's known, I think, probably as far as he can remember, that mom is working on a book about our family. When he was younger, I would just tell him about his Louisiana family. Of course, he knows my mom and siblings. But since all the grandparents were gone, I would just tell them their names. Burt Bridges' names, Mary's name. And then as he probably around middle school, maybe 6th, 7th grade is when I told him, I think, that I can remember telling him about what happened to his great-great-grandfather and what that meant. But just little pieces here and there as we were dealing with, as we continue to deal with public modern day lynchings, and kids are having to see those stories. And so I was able to connect as we're talking about, Lando Castile, whoever unfortunately is being lynched in modern times, connecting that to how this is part of a larger story. The things that you've heard in some of your classes or documentaries that we might watch, this is also personal to our family. But this is also who Burt Bridges was. He was this proud man who had a lot of potential. So balancing, the negative with the beautiful and the powerful. And I think today he's proud of he hasn't read the full book. He's read parts of it, and he's read, interviews that I've done about the book. But in his classrooms, AP English, for instance, they were reading Octavia Butler's Kindred. They started off with that. And he did bring in, what happened in his family. So those are some of the ways.
Very cool. Thanks for that, Ron. Any other questions?
I mean, I got more questions.
Ron, hold on.
I mean, I do. Ron made reference to it, and the only reason why I wouldn't jump to ask questions, because asking questions about this essay feels like crying because of how personal this is. And that's what I'm just going.
And I understand that, but I'm like so over it.
Right.
By the time someone reads something that I've written that's published, I've not completely, but I think when I'm crafting and I stay in my revision process for a really long time, I've done the work, internal work, and if it's out there, I'm fine talking about it. Yeah.
So we want to try and I guess more so connected to the present. So would you say in the circles you're navigating now, is there any version of that all white hip hop / R&B club that you deal with today? And do you cope with or react to those kind of settings differently, or are there aspects of yourself that you recognize from that essay that you still feel you kind of navigate the world with, and what spaces those might be?
Oh, no, I do feel in terms of my reaction. I mean, what I have now is, looking back on myself for when I was writing this, at the time that I was writing it, I think there was some like self-horror and embarrassment. But now when I think about just who I was at that time, there's compassion, there's understanding and forgiveness. And that's why I wanted to look at, the bigger picture, the bigger family story within this larger, of course, national story. But yeah, I mean, it's these situations, that club, that scene was just a metaphor for things that do continue to go on today. And I just look back on it with a little bit of humor, a lot of compassion, a deeper understanding. And when I'm in situations, I'm in a lot of situations where I'm the only, person of color, the only Black person. And I'm at a place in my life where I just feel confident. I feel like I more than deserve to be wherever I am. And if there are people who doubt that, yeah, there can be flares of, I feel indignant, but also I don't need to prove myself to anyone. The only person I need to prove myself to is myself and my family. So there's just love, understanding, and compassion, and complete, I just have no patience for people who are judging me based on the color of my skin, or even where I'm from. I mean, there are all kinds of discrimination, right? Even within the same group, people who judge you because you're not of a certain class, or don't speak a certain way, or live in a certain neighborhood. I have no patience for that, but I'm also not wounded by it, and I'm not debilitated by it. If anything, it just makes me fight harder to be and express myself.
And it's so brilliant to me to hear you say that now after reading Skinned, because what a great opportunity we have to read about the times when you weren't so confident and how it manifested, right? It is very difficult to write in a vulnerable way, especially about race, especially about partnership.
Yeah.
And you did that. It's funny because I think we all thought that this was a fictional story. And I said last week, I was like, I think that if this is fictional, I think that this is heavily, based on real life. It feels like she had a couple takes before she got this one out. And I think it's so grand, right? That we get to, this is such a great piece of work to me because of the vulnerability, and because you are witnessing somebody when they are not as vulnerable, when they are not as confident, and what that sounds like, what it looks like, and quite frankly, how irrational it looks, right? To some, right? To some, how crazy it looks,
Right.
how petty it looks. But that's the rub, right? So
and I didn't wash over that. Like, I think that's, even when you might do some healing and some growth or feel some more confidence when you're writing, it can be so easy to kind of wash over your own, soft spots or failures or mess ups. And I wanted to go back to that place, back to who I was as that young woman, back to those insecurities. And yeah, it's hard. But I agree. I'd rather be honest, and flesh out a full character, because I think readers can tell when you're not.
Oh yeah, we can tell. Cassandra, the only thing you're frozen. So try to turn your camera off and then turn it back on. Oh, we got you. You're back.
Okay.
Miss Roberson?
I think is she frozen now?
I'm good now, thank you. So I'm facing something because I'm trying to pull together my memoirs very late in life. And there, as you mentioned, many of the people are no longer here. So I'm wondering, what would you ask Bert Bridges?
Ugh. So many things. I think for me, Bert stood in as the fantasy of Bert stood in as a longing for a father. My father hasn't been in my life really since I was 5, and my mother divorced him, but I was looking for someone in the family who was the epitome of, strength and responsibility and beauty and creativity and romantic love for his partner. I would ask him, where did he get, our Grandma Mary would say he was the white people didn't like him because they thought he was so uppity or sedity. I would ask him, where did he get that sense of confidence, even in that time, even in that place, backwoods Mississippi, and even at that age, he was young. How did he have such a strong sense of self? Was he born with that? What was that cultivated? Who were his parents? What was his relationship like to his mother?
Oh my God, I'm so seeing something where you actually interview him. Oh my goodness.
As a creative piece? Oh, I like that.
Yeah, because I'm over here smiling. Thank you so much for sharing that.
And you can do that. You can do that with your project.
Yeah, I think that'd be really cool.
Might help me. That might help me, because I'm getting scared now that there are members of my family who are still living who are not going to like some things.
Oh, yeah.
So, but thank you. Yeah, I can see that interview, Miss Lane.
Thanks for that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Any more questions? Ron, go ahead.
So when you first logged on, I felt a little twinge when you said you're no longer with your husband. I don't need to know what happened, but where you are now, does it feel like it was a natural progression? I mean, considering like you kind of early on in your piece, you kind of detail that even though you're both in love, you are both a little different. And was where you're at now, was that an extension of that difference?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that my mom would say that. She was never, because he's almost 14 years older, and when he met me, I was 25, and so she had her own issues about that, and the fact that he was a Yankee, just hilarious. She just had a thing about New Yorkers, I think because of some stuff that happened on her job. I don't know. So there were those obvious sort of differences, place, culture, age, but yeah, and I do talk about what happened in the book, We Are Bridges, but I think so. I think it was an outgrowth of some vast kind of distance between us. And then when we moved in New Orleans, it was easier because we were, New Orleans, if you've been in New Orleans, I mean, we were part of a it was just such a tight-knit community. You can get anywhere in 10 minutes. We always had people over at the house. It was just, marriages do not exist in a silo. You need community. And I think, well, not think, but that's what we lost when we moved to Los Angeles. And I immediately had a community because I immediately started my, within 3 months, my MFA program. So I had writers, but he really struggled. He was hired, Associated Press hired him supposedly to do the kind of work, documentary work that he was doing in New Orleans, and that's not what they did. They had him, covering celebrities getting their stars and Lakers games, and he was very, very resentful and angry, and so huge here and so spread out. We just didn't have that warmth and continuity that we had. So those differences between us, I think, became more just more obvious and more just more distant. Yeah. He now lives in Norway. Like that's his, I don't even know if he cares about people knowing his name, but his passion is photography, and not just photography, but telling marginalized people's stories all over the world. He was in Peru for 3 years after we first moved on with our lives with each other. Then he was in, South Africa. No, he was in Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, and then he was splitting his time between Norway and parts of the continent, and now he's pretty much full-time in Norway. And I love traveling. I can see myself living for a little bit out of the States, but family means more to me. Like I can't imagine not, being able to see my family at least once a year. So we were going in different directions to some degree, even though we deeply, deeply support and love each other's creative work. There were just some non-negotiables, I guess. Somebody has chat.
Oh, did someone?
Oh, Ms. Robertson, her 36-year-old son lives in LA in West Hollywood. Oh, where does he write? Writes about culture, philanthropy journalist. He loves lessons. I know New Yorkers hate us. We don't hate y'all though. That's so funny.
It's very one-sided. It's a very one-sided beef. Very much so.
I don't get it. I love New York too. Who does he work for?
He does a lot of writing. I mean, I'm afraid to say his most recent assignment was for the Grammy thing, but he does a lot of different writing. Not cool. Just any not vacuous things like that only, but
yeah.
He writes, and he's also a meteorology nerd. So he writes about weather, he writes about climate justice, he writes about music, he writes about literature, he writes about.
Oh, I love that. I love that. How long has he been in LA?
Too long. He's 36 and he left at 17 to go away to college to Pomona. He hasn't been back.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he loves it. I can't believe it.
My
and
mom.
You want to know why we make fun of it? Because it used to be in New York, there was a newsstand and bookstores and magazine stores on just about every corner. In LA, that was never the case. Okay, I rest my case.
Well, you're not walking. You can go to certain neighborhoods in LA that are more walkable, and you can see some of that. But yeah, we're desert. We're too spread out.
Any other questions from Ms. Cassandra Lane? Whitney, did you have your hand up?
I do have another question.
Is it a personal question?
No.
Okay.
It's basically it's basically about your latest book, Can you tell us about that, or a book that you're working on? I saw a picture of you and Mitchell Jackson together. Who
Oh, I don't
who
think it was Mitch. Was it Mitchell?
was
I
it?
don't.
Mitch? I thought it was Mitch.
I think it might have been because I don't think I've met Mitch in person.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Maybe it
I
was
want-
someone else.
Yeah, I think I know who you're talking about. It's oh my God, no, Maurice Ruffin. Was it Maurice
Could
Ruffin?
be. Could be.
Yeah, yeah, because we were at AWP together well, I saw him at AWP.
Yeah.
Um, so your question is what I'm working on
Just
right now?
about your latest or your most recent book.
Oh, okay. So yeah, it's my debut and it came out in the height of, early days of or well, second year of the pandemic, 2021. And it's an outgrowth really of this essay. I wanted to go deeper. I thought initially that I was going to write a novel about Burt Bridges, that I would just have to make up everything, and that it was going to be a fictionalized story since I didn't have research, there are no documents. But as I was workshopping it in the MFA program, and then later once I graduated with my workshop, I started keeping a journal and writing like personal essays about it. And the feedback was, you need to bridge these two stories, like what's going on with you in this modern contemporary sense with your ancestor story. And that's eventually, it took so long because structure is something that I struggle with, but that's ultimately what I think started giving it life. And then I became at first I was not planning on having children, but when I did get pregnant, the book took on a new life, and I turned to not only Burt Bridges but the women in the family, and had a deeper appreciation for them and for Mary. I mean, they were survivors and thrivers, and so their stories, they started speaking to me as well. And the book goes back and forth between the past and present day, which is really over that 9-month period. That's how I structured it, over that 9-month period of my pregnancy. And interwoven with that are 9 chapters based in 1904, which is the year that he was most likely lynched. And I have Mary pregnant with my mother's father, which she most likely was, because my grandfather was born in 1904, November of 1904. So she finds what happens to Bert. She's pregnant, she's dealing with that. We don't see her having her son, but she does have her son in the book. And then the book ends basically with me giving birth to a new generation. And then it goes back in time to an imagined story of Mary and the woman who was caring for her right after she gave birth to Houston, which my grandfather.
And I popped the link to the book in the chat. It sounds fascinating. The one I popped in is the Feminist Book Press.
Oh, that's the publisher, yeah.
Yeah, so if you feel inclined to get the book, please do. Any other questions?
Yeah, I just want to quickly ask, Ms. Lane, do you know if Burt Bridges is somehow included in the so-called lynching museum in Alabama?
I called them, I emailed them. They were talking to me, just very, very loving and helpful. Did not find his name, but there are so many unknowns.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah.
So I searched a lot of newspaper, digitized, old newspapers, a lot of unknowns in that area. So it most likely happened in the area, if not the town. My grandfather was born, at least it says on his delayed birth certificate, in a town called Holmesville, Mississippi, which I did go back I did visit it once in 2018 when I was in New Orleans. That doesn't end up in the book because we stopped it.
Yeah.
I wrote it, but we ended up cutting that out. So there are some newspaper clippings about around that time of Black men being, who were lynched, but there's no name.
Yeah.
He's one of the unknowns.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll now also Google Ida B. Lewis and see if there's anything she did in that area.
Oh, okay.
There, I'm sorry, Ms. Paula, were you gonna chime in, Professor? Any other questions? Yeah, one thing I was thinking about just kind of listening to this conversation, but also the conversation we had last week, is, I don't know, it just kind of gets me wondering about racial trauma and partnership, especially when it comes to Black and white Americans. And it seems like, then when this book was written, when this essay was written, and now it kind of seems like that. I have no proof of this, but it just kind of seems like even though a lot of the Black men were being lynched by white hands, it seems like it's a lot of the Black women who are holding on to the trauma. Is that just me? You know what I'm saying? Rick wasn't as traumatized as you were. It didn't happen to his family, but he is a Black man. He was not as traumatized as you were in these pages.
Right.
Could not take it. Like it was on you. It was stuck on you.
Yeah, yeah. Or I wonder if it's a matter of like consciousness versus unconsciousness. When it's, the way men are socialized just in general, not to make generalizations, but just in general, just not expressing the emotions. And he and I have talked a lot about this. He read the book and just about our past, and he's done a lot of healing work too after the fact. He did a 2-week silent retreat and therapy and the things that came up for him. Again, this is after the marriage is over, but he said in a letter that he wrote me once that he was feeling so much, but the only emotion that he felt comfortable expressing was anger. And I think that can be, unfortunately a trap, because they're not, in general, again, conditioned to express all the range of emotions. To express insecurity, that's not manly. Express jealousy, express, fear. That's not necessarily accepted, or it wasn't. I try to make sure that my son has, or we try to make sure our son has the range. But even so, like even raising him from a young kid with like tears are okay, they're still getting different messages even today from social media, from friends. So I don't know if they're not as traumatized or if it's just a matter of they don't know how to express it, or they're not conscious of that trauma. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant discussion. Before we log off, please don't forget, We Are Bridges. It's a pretty recent, it just came out in 2021. So please do grab a copy to support Miss Lane. I'm sure it's brilliant. We've already got a nice taste of her writing and Skinned. So please support and grab the book if you can. But also, if you're on Instagram, I popped in. Is it okay if we follow you on Instagram? Okay. I popped in her Instagram in the chat. So please do give her a follow. Stay up to date on what she's doing. This has been such an amazing chat. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
so
Yeah.
incredibly
I love
generous.
what you guys are doing. I love Book One Bronx, and I'm just honored to be here with you this evening. One of my friends grew up in the Bronx, she's still there, Melissa Cosacchino. I think she's
Oh,
visited you guys a couple of times. She just had a
yeah,
book
yeah.
came.
She was in the book club, yeah, when we read The Bluest Eye.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
She
And
was
she's a
excited.
friend. Yeah, she's a good friend.
Oh, great. Oh, great. She was really
Yeah.
excited that I was
We
coming
hope to
on.
read her book too this year. It's been just a crazy couple years, but we hope to read her book this year.
Yeah, it's powerful. She came out here and we did a talk together at Octavia Bookstore in Pasadena.
Mm.
So yeah.
Very cool. Awesome.
What are you reading next?
Giovanni's Room by James
Oh,
Baldwin.
I think I saw that online. Awesome. That's
Yeah,
wonderful.
yes, very excited. It'll be on Zoom, so if you want to join us or any of your LA homies, please do.
Okay, great.
Any other last